You've been lied to about gardening. Some of the most common advice, like crop rotation or avoiding tap water when watering your plants, might actually be harming your garden and hurting your plants. Well, that changes today. I'm busting some of the biggest and most common gardening myths so that you can grow bigger, better, healthier plants in a healthier garden. So sit back, hit that full screen button, and let's dig in. You seem to really love the last gardening myth video that I did, so I thought I'd tackle it again with a few more common myths, a lot of which have come from the comments of that video of you guys asking me to tackle certain topics. And I even have one additional thing to add to one of the myths from last video. Now let's start with a bit of a doozy of a one that we have to get a little bit deep into, but don't worry, I'll make it simple at the end. Tackling tap water. Something you'll hear over and over again is that tap water is harmful to plants because of its chlorine content, that chlorine's in there to get rid of all the bugs, nasties and bacteria out of tap water. So therefore shouldn't do the same thing to your garden and therefore probably kill your plants, inhibit the growth, maybe harm beneficial bacteria. Well, there's more differences between tap water and rainwater than just the chlorine content, so let's dive into that a little bit so that you know what's best for your garden. Let's start by talking about the main differences between tap water and rainwater, at least where gardeners are concerned. And I probably actually need to start this segment by acknowledging that throughout the whole world, no two tap waters are going to be the same. They're different between reservoir to reservoir. So I'll keep the information fairly general and in a way that you should still be able to apply to wherever it is that you live. Well, let's start with a big one, chlorine. So tap water uses chlorine and sometimes alternatively chloramine to get rid of harmful bacteria in water. Now, when it comes to the garden, if you excessively and exclusively use tap water on your garden, you can actually maybe reduce the microbial diversity of your garden. But for that to happen, you need to get pretty close to some pretty unique, not really real world scenarios. You need to have really, really poor soil and next to no rainfall where you are in order to get to those sort of circumstances. So that's not really something that you need to worry about in your general garden. However, it can actually impact particularly sensitive plants such as seedlings and also really pH sensitive plants. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. However, if chlorine buildup is something that you're worried about, or you need to water sensitive plants, there is a really simple solution using only a bucket. And that's because of the fact that chlorine actually evaporates really quickly. If you fill up a bucket with water and then leave it out for 24 hours, the vast majority of the chlorine will have just evaporated out. However, there are some other considerations to be made when looking at other differences between tap water and rainwater besides chlorine. The first one to look at is pH. The goal of tap water is to have it be as incredibly neutral as possible, right on 7, but it typically ranges from 7 to 8. However, rainwater is a fair bit more acidic than that. It usually is about 5.6 pH, which is about as acidic as a cucumber, a little bit less acidic than a tomato. It's in that sort of range. What that does mean is that any plants that demand a really acidic condition, such as blueberries or roses, you might want to prioritize using any rainwater that you've collected on those first before then moving to the rest of your garden. In reality, it's not going to make that big of a difference, but every little bit can help. And in case you're wondering, the reason that rainwater is more acidic is because it contains more dissolved CO2 in it. The other big difference between rainwater and tap water you might want to be aware of is the mineral content of your tap water, but this depends entirely on your local reservoir's water chemistry. You might have really hard water, which means it has a really high mineral content of magnesium, calcium, sodium, which are micronutrients that can benefit your garden, but they can also be in an overabundance and cause issues for your garden. If you want to know more about micronutrients and soil pH and how that affects the way that your plants use nutrients, make sure to check out my Everything You Need to Know About Fertilizer video. But if you're wondering about your particular tap water, at least in Australia, you can actually call up your local reservoir and ask for their latest water chemistry tests, and they'll tell you a bunch of information about it, where you can check things like the chlorine and mineral contents. But thankfully, through most of Australia, we have pretty soft water that's pretty low in mineral content, so that's not really much of an issue for us. And it also means that we need to decalcify our kettles a lot less. So where does that leave us in terms of a practical guide of using tap water versus rainwater? In general, tap water is going to be fine. However, if you are able to capture and save some rainwater, some of the best places to use that are going to be on your seedlings in particular, because they're quite sensitive and they will generally really like it, and then acidic loving plants. But for the rest of your garden, it doesn't really matter either way. There are some really, really marginal, tiny advantages to using rainwater over tap water, but it's nothing to really be concerned about in the home garden, especially as long as you're regularly doing soil pH tests. And then after that, if you're noticing anything else weird going on with your plants, then just maybe checking out if you've got the right micronutrients in your soil. Whew, that was a bit of a dense one to start with, so let's jump through a couple of quick and fun ones. Banana water. Something you see a whole lot on the gardening part of the internet at the moment is when you have leftover banana peels, throw them in some water, let them marinate for a couple days, and then water your garden with that, and it creates a natural pest resistance. And it fertilizes your gardens because bananas are rich in potassium and calcium and all of these beneficial nutrients for your garden. Except it doesn't work. Here's why. All those nutrients in the banana peel are physically bound within the peel and aren't dissolved into the water, no matter how long you soak it for. Instead, you're so much better off throwing those banana peels into the compost, because when they're broken down by the microbes in that way, those nutrients that are really abundant in those banana peels actually get broken down and become available to whatever plants you then eventually plant in that compost. And I've touched on it before, but it's a similar deal with eggshells. It's actually quicker for your plants to gain access to the nutrients in eggshells by composting them through your compost over the course of a couple months, 6 months, and then putting that compost into your garden. Your plants can then use those nutrients immediately, as opposed to throwing the eggshells straight into your soil. Takes 18 months plus for those eggshells to eventually break down to the point that your plants can start absorbing that calcium. When it comes to eggshells and banana peels, the slow way is the fast way. Next is that you can regrow veggies from kitchen scraps. Now, there are a whole bunch of things that you can actually go and buy in the supermarket, take home, sow, and then grow into your entirely own plant and harvest forever. But the thing is that most of those that actually work don't end up in a lot of these viral videos where they show you regrowing things from kitchen scraps. Some of the most egregious examples are when they take just the top part of a carrot, chuck that in water and show the green top bit grow a little bit. That carrot will never regrow. The taproot is gone. It's a similar story with broccoli and onions, and a lot of the fruits that you buy in the supermarket aren't true to seed type. So whenever you plant a seed from a bit of fruit from the supermarket, the plant that then grows either won't produce at all or will just produce a completely different variety of whatever you've planted. Now, I'll eventually make an entire video about this, but here are a couple things that you can buy from the supermarket that you can take home and plant straight away, but you can look into in your own time how to actually grow those plants. Anything where what you're buying is a dried seed, such as peas and beans, you can generally take dried peas and beans home, plant them, and they will grow. Another good one is garlic, but you will probably also get better results if you buy that garlic from a local farmer's market, as garlic takes a couple years to get used to your soil conditions, and when you're getting it from the supermarket, you don't really know where it's from, whereas with a farmer's market, hopefully it's being grown close to you. And a similar thing can be said for ginger and turmeric. What you buy is actually a rhizome that you can plant in the ground and get your whole own plant that will produce more ginger and turmeric. Taking a hunk of celery, cutting off all the stems, planting that in water, you can actually start to get it to regrow to the point where you might be able to plant it back out. And then if you can find any heirloom or non-hybridized veggies, especially with things like pumpkins and tomatoes, you can generally harvest the seeds from those and then plant them again. For the vast majority of things that you can buy in the produce section, you can't take the vegetable itself, somehow put that vegetable in water, and then continue growing the vegetable for infinite harvest. And it's annoying because those videos go viral so often, and a fair few people must try that, and that might be the first thing that they're attempting in gardening, and it doesn't work out. And they might give up on trying to grow their own food, or because this is their very first introduction to it and it's something completely fraudulent. But if you want to see an entire video where I tell you all the plants that you can get for free or buy from the supermarket and then plant at home, make sure to hit subscribe because I will make it eventually. The next myth is that learning a new skill has to be expensive, difficult, and you can't learn directly from some of the world's leading experts in their field. Well, thankfully that myth is finally busted with today's video sponsor, Skillshare. I've said it before and I'll say it again, that the hobby of gardening is essentially the hobby of constantly learning and improving, with sometimes harvesting and eating a few veggies in between. And I think one of the reasons that I've been able to improve at gardening so quickly is because I'm constantly tackling other skill-based hobbies such as music or photography or now filmmaking with making YouTube videos. And Skillshare have been a meaningful partner to me in that journey long before they've been a sponsor of the channel. I think there's a really obvious turning point in the quality of my videos before and after I took the Marques Brownlee course on Skillshare on making better YouTube videos. And since taking that course and applying it to my videos, you guys give me lots of compliments now about my cinematic video style, which I don't think is all that cinematic, but it's definitely a lot better than whatever it used to be. And Skillshare is a platform that lets you take as many online courses in as many different disciplines and hobbies and skill sets as you want. And you don't have to pay per individual course, which if this existed when I was in uni, my God, I would have saved so much money. And if you want to give it a go for free, you can. The first 500 people that click the link in the description will be able to get the first month of Skillshare for free. You can learn about 4 or 5 new hobbies in that time, or just take the handful of gardening courses that are already on Skillshare. It's such a great platform, consider checking it out. Now let's get back to more myths. I want to talk about an additional interesting point to one of the myths from the last video. This was the myth about watering your plants during the day can burn them. And spoiler alerts, it doesn't. That doesn't happen. But one comment made a really interesting observation that might be the cause of where this myth comes from, and it's something that potentially a lot of us might actually get caught out by, because it's quite possibly a realistic issue. And that's when you have the hose out during the daytime and you leave it out in the hot sun, the water in the hose can actually get hot enough to burn your plants. And over the last couple of days, we've had some 35-degree-plus days. I've done some testing of leaving the hose out, pouring out that first pour of water, and then seeing what temperature it hits. And it's gotten close to 50 degrees Celsius, which might actually be hot enough to do some decent damage to your plants. So now, for the rest of my life, anytime, especially during hot weather, I'm watering my plants, I am definitely doing a couple touch tests of the water to make sure it's cold, because when you put your hand in front of it when it's straight out of the hose, you will realize that's definitely something that might actually cause some legitimate problems in your garden. Now the next one might actually shock you a bit, and the myth is that soil needs to be as aerated as possible. And that is not really true, which you might find surprising if you watch all of my videos, because I'm usually banging on quite a bit about how your soil needs to be aerated. In fact, really healthy soil needs to be about 25% air, which probably sounds like a lot, and it is. But what that does not mean is that your soil needs to be as aerated as possible. Think about when you first apply a batch of compost to the top of a garden bed, and then over the next couple months, it seems to shrink down to maybe half or a quarter of that height. Now, once that's settled down, that's probably actually about the right amount of density and air content. And the reason is there's a big difference between a big loose soil and a nice firm but aerated soil. And when starting any new garden bed, one of the best things that you can do is actually just walk over the top of it once, just to firm down that initial amount of air out of the soil, because what that helps it do is any plant roots that are in the soil actually helps make contact with the soil and nutrients and water in there. Otherwise, they might just be sitting around in large pockets of air and actually can hinder the growth of your plants. So even though soil aeration is really important, like many things in gardening, it can be overdone. And this one you definitely don't want to overdo. Before we get to the last big myth that has a lot of fun and complexity to it, I do just want to thank the Patreons for supporting this channel. If you want to help keep the channel rolling so that I can bring you some bigger and better videos, consider checking it out. Now let's get back to that last myth. Okay, crop rotation. And this one I'm probably going to get some negative comments about, so make sure to leave this video a green thumbs up so that YouTube still knows that this is a good and valuable video that it should show other people. The myth is you need to crop rotate. Well, what is crop rotation and why do people do it? Crop rotation is when you regularly change the crop that you're growing in a given patch of soil to prevent disease and help manage pests and soil fertility. Say you might grow broccoli in one spot, and then once that's done, you grow beans there, then once that's done, you grow beetroot there, and then so on and so forth. And you might eventually get back around to broccoli and repeat the cycle. It's a practice that comes from farming, and anything that farmers do, gardeners should do too, right? Well, you'll see. So when it comes to things like preventing disease, things like tomato blight, brassica clubroot or root rot, rotating crops can really help break these disease cycles. However, most of these diseases not only travel through soil, but are also airborne. And in order to use crop rotation to effectively break those disease cycles, you need to move your crop not from one garden bed to another. You need to move them from one paddock to another paddock down the road. If I move my tomatoes from here to here, there's potentially still going to be blight spores that have managed to drift on the wind onto this soil, and I'm still going to end up with the same issue next season. Thankfully, home gardeners actually have better resources to prevent and deal with those diseases in ways that are far better and more effective than crop rotation. If you're regularly adding compost and using a nice organic-based mulch, you're stimulating a really healthy microbiome in your soil that can actually fight off a lot of these pathogens naturally. Another really effective way to break these disease cycles is just interplanting a few crops really close to each other. Interplanting is surprisingly effective against these sorts of diseases. It's just something that's impractical for large-scale farming to do, but is dead easy in the garden. And in fact, it makes our garden more productive because we're growing more crops with the same amount of space. And then during the cooler months, just try not to leave your plants wet at night, and it'll help prevent some fungal issues. Another big reason farmers use crop rotation is you don't want to have a couple of big heavy feeders all planted in the same spot after each other. Things like corn and leafy greens suck a lot of nutrients, especially nitrogen, out of the soil, and if you plant the same thing there over and over again, those following crops can go a bit hungry, so they'll rotate out those crops with some lighter feeders or even things like peas and beans that will then help reintroduce nitrogen into the soil. But in the home garden, we can just add in more compost or top up with organic fertilizers. That's something that would be really expensive for farms to do on that large of a scale, but for us, it's as simple as throwing a couple kitchen scraps in a corner of the yard for 6 months and then putting them back into the garden. And now we get to skip a whole bunch of complexity with avoiding crop rotation. The last big reason farmers do crop rotation is that it helps lower the pressure from pests. The big reason that this works is things like cabbage moths will learn where all of the big brassicas are, keep going there to keep breeding. But if you move where all those brassicas are to a different location, they'll come back and there's no more brassicas for them to breed in, and the farmer's pest pressure is severely reduced. But similar to diseases, for this to work, you need to move paddocks away. If you're still in the same backyard, those cabbage moths are still going to find your cabbages. So as home gardeners, we don't actually get any additional benefit from pest prevention from crop rotation. In short, crop rotation just isn't something we have to worry about in the home garden. It's a solution to problems that we can solve in much more effective ways than moving a few plants around. And gardening's already complicated enough as it is. We don't need to add in additional math about trying to not plant the same thing in the same spot twice in a row. Thank you very much. Remember, if you want to try and learn some new skills, you can use my first month free of Skillshare in the description. Please comment with any other myths you want me to tackle. I'll see you next time.